Never saw her in my life. Never. I had this chutz this week to go visit Mrs. Khan, the Biel Khan's wife. Just for a sense of perspective, she got married in 1954. She got married 71 years ago. So how old is she? She's 39 plus a few, you know what I'm saying? She's amazing. Mrs. Khan, she's probably 90 or over 90. She was married to Rabbi Yoel. And my wife and I went to see her. We spent a long time in her house. And we talked about that Rebbe, we talked about that Rebbe's mother. I was trying to get her to tell some stories that I didn't know. Chavi, you gotta stop talking. But she knew that she had a relationship with the Rebbe. And she told me different things. One of the things she told me was that when you walked into the house of the Rebbetzin, you felt her power. She was physically very small. When you walked into her presence, you said, "Oh my, this is a power." She didn't have to open her mouth. Just being in her presence, this woman is powerful. She was so strong. And she also told me very repeatedly that the Rebbetzin saw herself, that she was the granddaughter of the Rebbe Rashab. Are you a visitor to this class?
No.
So you don't know the rules? I said you don't know the rules? Rule number 1, you don't eat in class. Rule number 2, you have to sit facing the front. There's plenty of seats. You can sit right here in the front, the worst seat in the house. Many, many years ago, I taught Beis Rivka's 12th grade. The girls used to run in and go to the back. Nebuch, the last girls had no choice but to sit. Young lady, sit right here. So she told me, Mrs. Khan told me, that Rebbe saw herself as a member of the Beis Harav, as the granddaughter of the Rebbe Rashab, as the Friedrich Rebbe's daughter, as the Rebbe's Rebbetzin, and that therefore her purpose was to help people. She saw herself as a person whose job it was to help people. And it was very real for her. So she said to me, Mrs. Khan told me some things which were very interesting. She said to me, number 1, you could call her anytime, day or night, she'd pick up the phone. And when she talked to you, you never felt like you're bothering her. Call a lady 5 o'clock in the morning, She's sleeping, The Rebbe was never asleep. She picked up the phone on the first ring. And she was so gracious. So people would call her up in the middle. They didn't call her for fun. They called her for emergencies. Chas v'shalom, someone was very sick, and you needed to get to the Rebbe in the middle of the night. So the people who had the Rebbe's phone number, I didn't have the Rebbe's phone, the Rebbe's apartment on President Street was not listed in the phone book. You understand? There was an unlisted number. But a lot of people knew that number. And you would call 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. She'd pick up the phone, and she would go into the Rebbe and tell the Rebbe what the situation was and come back on the phone and give you an answer and a bracha and an advice. The only time she hated to disturb the Rebbe was the Rebbe pushed lay down. 5 o'clock in the morning, apparently, the Rebbe took a nap for an hour or two. The Rebbe didn't sleep. And when you called at that hour, she would say, I really don't want to bother him. And then she would bother him anyway. If someone called with an emergency, even that hour or two that the Rebbe was asleep, if it was really an emergency, she had to make that judgment. She would go into the Rebbe and she would bother the Rebbe. And so a person once called her the next day and apologized for bothering her in the middle of the night. So the Rebbe said, "Der Far sein and mir da." This is the reason we're here. We're here to help people. And the Rebbe once told somebody who was apologizing and calling in the middle of the night, quote, "Thank you for helping us do our job." That's how she saw herself. The Rebbe saw herself as a person who was here to help people. But the most interesting, so one of the things Mrs. Khan told me, and I don't know if I should repeat this, but she says it was very hard to know the Rebbe. She knew you. She says, I never knew if she likes me. Can you imagine? She had many conversations with the Rebbe, and she was never sure how the Rebbe feels about her. Because the Rebbe was impossible to read. You never knew what she was thinking, because she was just someplace else. And the most interesting thing Mrs. Khan told me was, people used to come over to her and say, Mora Khan, she was a teacher here for 50 years. You knew the Rebbe and worked about the Rebbe. You know what she would say? Call her up, make an appointment. She'll meet you. Mrs. Khan told me that anybody who wanted could have called the house and made an appointment, and the Rebbe would have seen them. But people were afraid to do it. That's what she said. She said to me, if somebody wanted to speak to the Rebbe, yeah. Oh, the Rebbe, how do you know the Rebbetzin? Well, my husband, my uncle, my aunt, my brother-in-law, can I meet the Rebbetzin? So Mrs. Kahn said, call the house, show him Gan, he'll pick up the phone, he'll give you an appointment, come and see you. The Rebbetzin would have seen everybody. This is what Mrs. Kahn said to me. The Rebbetzin would have seen everybody if they made phone calls and called the people who were afraid to call. This is news to me. I had this meeting Sunday night. So now it's Thursday and I'm already repeating it. That's the problem with me. You tell me something, I'm going to repeat it. But isn't that interesting? This is what she said. Mrs. Kahn said that Rebbetzin was very private. She didn't hang around 770. She hated covet. She used to say to Mrs. Kahn all the time, "Ich darf es nicht. I don't need any of the respect." She told me two interesting things about Rebbetzins personality. Number one, the Rebbetzin didn't need any honor. And number two, the Rebbetzin did not know the meaning of loneliness. Because she didn't need people. The Rebbetzin was the kind of person, if she was all by herself, she was fine. She didn't need other people. Some people, if there are no people around, they get uncomfortable. The Rebbetzin was very happy to be by herself. She didn't need people. She was perfectly fine. And she hated the notoriety. But this is what she told me that I found, this was like a chiddush to me, that Mrs. Kahn knew her well. You have to understand, Mrs. Kahn's mother's last name was Schneerson. Mrs. Kahn's mother and the Rebbe's father, Mrs. Kahn's mother, Yehudas Butman, and the Rebbe's father were first cousins. Which meant Yael Kahn, Mrs. Kahn, and the Rebbe were Pashut's second cousins. Second cousins, they were close. And she had a relationship with the Rebbetzin. They used to talk in Russian all the time when they met. And she told me these different things that I just told you. I was trying to get more out of her. And, we talked for a long time. She talked about different things. Talked about the Rebbe's mother. She said the Rebbe's mother was lonely. But the Rebbetzin, she was never lonely because she Pashut did not need people. She was fine all by herself. She didn't need people. She certainly didn't need covet. But that she lived to help people. And that's how the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin saw themselves, that they're here to help people. So this is the halom. Okay, so we're talking about the Rebbetzin. Her birthday is in 5 days. Hence, I want to talk about the Rebbetzin a little bit. And there's a couple of things you have to understand. All of the stories I'm telling you, I heard or I read. I'm working on making up stories, I haven't reached that age. When you turn 70, not I'll start making up stories. I'll remember having met her and sat in her house, even though it never happened. I'll reach the age where I'll start making stuff up. But the stories that I tell, I can't promise you that they're true. I can just tell you that I didn't make them up. The stories that I read, the stories that I heard, and people's, I figured out that people, when they repeat things, often make mistakes in the repetition. They don't even realize that they're making mistakes. So I'm going to share some things with you about the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. This is so hard to explain, so I'm going to skip it. The Frierdiker passed away. And there became a question of who would be the next Rebbe. There's a lot of details about that story that are not important. They're certainly not important now. But one of the issues that was going on was that the Rebbe refused to be a Rebbe. Our Rebbe refused to be a Rebbe. I'm not a Rebbe, I'm an Edom, I'm a son-in-law. And it took a whole year of lobbying. People worked very, very hard to make the Rebbe into the Rebbe. And the way I understand that, like you have to remember, in 1950, I was negative. I was born 15 and a half years later after the Rebbe became a Rebbe. So like I said, when I turned 75 or 80 or 90, I'll remember being there, but the Vaila, I wasn't there. So it's stories that you hear and you read and you try to feel. And the sense that you get about the Rebbe becoming Rebbe is, and I'm going to say it the way I understand it, is that Chassidim changed the Rebbe's mind. The Rebbe was not planning to be a Rebbe, and they changed his mind. They convinced the Rebbe that he must become a Rebbe, and the Rebbe acquiesced. He gave in to the wishes of the Chassidim. But the Rebbetzin played a very important role in this. The Rebbetzin, and Mrs. Kahn told this to me on Sunday night, and I asked her, how does she know that the story is true? And she said, well, I didn't hear it from the Rebbetzin, but everybody knows that the story is true. That the Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka said to the Rebbe, if you do not become Rebbe, the 30 years of Mesiras Nefesh of my father is going to go to nothing. It's going to end up with nothing. You must take the job. And people say, I heard this from Rabbi Weinberg, Shalom, that people say that the Rebbetzins words to the Rebbe, that if you don't take the job, the 30 years of my father's Mesiras Nefesh are going to go to nothing, was a very important basis for the Rebbe being Makabel the Nesiyas. Now I'm going to tell you some stories that I don't have very good sources for. Okay, I forgot from whom I heard it, but these are very, very powerful stories. That when the Rebbe became Rebbe, the Rebbetzin called 3 Chassidim. And one of them was Rabbi Simpson. The other 2 I don't know. To the house. Now remember, the Rebbetzin was not living in President. She was living in an apartment on New York and President and New York in the corner. They came to the house, and the Rebbetzin told them the following. All the Rebbetzins looked after their husbands. All of the Rebbetzins looked after their husbands. They took care of them physically. They took care of their clothes, took care of their food. They took care of them physically. I'm going to do that also. I'm going to look after the Rebbe. I'll take care of them physically. But then she said, the Rebbetzins also would tell their husbands when it was enough. If the Rebbe pushed himself too far, the Rebbetzin would say, stop. We know stories, By the Rebbe Rashab, his wife, his mother walked into the middle of Fabring and said, stop, The Rebbetzins used to tell their husbands the Rebbe when it was enough, when they had to stop. And she said to them, that I'm not going to do. I will not stop my husband. That's your job. I heard the story from I don't know whom, but I heard it a while ago. She said, I'll take care of him. I'll make sure I'll take care of him physically. But I will not tell him to stop. That's on you. Now, a Lashon Hara Ma'aseh, a story that I think I know from whom I heard it, that there was a boy who was very close to the Rebbe's Medina, to the Friedrich Rebbe's wife. So it was once after Simchas Torah, after Yom Tif, he went into the Rebbe's Medina, and the Rebbe's Medina asked him what happened by the Rebbe. What time was the Fabringen? How long did the Fabringen go? The Rebbe Fabringen for 10 hours. The Fabringen for 12 hours. He went on non-stop. So the Rebbe's Medina said, tardos nicht tanzu mein Tochter. You know what that means? It's in Yiddish. The Rebbe said, he's not allowed to do that to my daughter. She was complaining that the Rebbe is pushing himself so hard at the expense of the Rebbe Tzachai Bushkin. She used to say, my man had yechidus, my sheret had yechidus, my husband did yechidus, my father did yechidus. But no one sat in yechidus from 8 o'clock at night till 10 o'clock the next morning. The Rebbe Medina complained that the Rebbe was pushing himself too hard. And the Rebbe told Chassidim, I'm not going to stop her on him. On you, it's on you. And stopping the Rebbe was a trip. The Rebbe pushed himself, you have no idea. Non-stop, day and night, the Rebbe pushed himself. I heard once a word, in the very early years, there was a Matzah Shavuos, I think, and the Rebbe Fabring all night. And one chassid was leaving the Fabringen at the end of Keshe Bracha. Another chassid was coming from out of town to get Keshe Bracha, and they met and they started to talk. And he says to the chassid who was leaving, he said to the chassid who was coming, are you here by the Fabringen? He says, no, you missed the Maimed. The Rebbe said, a Maimed night, it's unbelievable. And the second chassid said to the first chassid, but the Rebbe is pushing himself so hard, he Fabringen so long, he doesn't stop. So the first chassid said to the second chassid, in Yiddish, he said, by jenem Rebbe hat sich allemal gemacht der Chutzpahnik, was die kennen sagen im Rebbe Mavot. By the previous Rebbe, there was always a Chutzpahnik who could say to the Rebbe, no, stop, it's enough. Our Rebbe, is fire. Our Rebbe is fire, you can't stop him. He's full steam. You couldn't stop the Rebbe. The Rebbe went non-stop. The Rebbe didn't stop himself ever. The Rebbe pushed himself. On a shir, the Rebbe pushed himself. And the Rebbe said, I'll take care of him, but I'm not going to stop him. That's on you. And there are all kinds of stories about Chassidim trying to tell the Rebbe, how to say it in American, that he should slow down, that he shouldn't work so hard. There's all kinds of stories about, and sometimes the Rebbe took it, and sometimes the Rebbe didn't take it. If you ever said to the Rebbe in public, slow down, the Rebbe said, excuse me? You can actually hear on a tape, a man walks over to the Rebbe in a Fabringen Purim, and he starts to say something to the Rebbe about the Rebbe watching his health and stopping to Fabring. And the Rebbe says to him, you can push it here on the tape. Willst du benehmen dem schwer? You want the Friedrich Rebbe's job? You want the job? I got the job. You want it? You don't want it. Sit down. But you can push it here on the tape, how he says to this man, Willst du benehmen dem schwer? You want to have the Friedrich Rebbe's job? In other words, I got the job. You don't want it, right? Sit down. Don't tell me how to do my job. Willst du benehmen dem schwer? You want to have the Friedrich Rebbe's job? There's a story where they went into the Rebbe privately, into the Rebbe's room, and talked to the Rebbe watching his health. And the Rebbe said he would. He shortened Yechidus. He never actually listened to them. But if you ever went over to him in the middle of a Fabringen and tried to tell him to stop, In other words, you can tell him privately, but in public, the Rebbe didn't want anybody's help. But here's a story that I know for a fact. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Let me first give you a different story, okay? Tishrei once, 1,200 Bachrim came as guests to the Fabrengen, to Tishrei. 1,200 Bachrim came for Tishrei to the Rebbe, okay? Now you're listening to me? Most of you are doodling in the Bechina of, you're so into the doodle, you don't even know that I'm talking about the fact that you're doodling. Every one of these boys needed a yechidus. 1,200 boys, each one of them needed a yechidus. And the Rebbe had 2 nights for it, Tuesday night and Wednesday night. 600 Bachrim one night, 600 Bachrim the other night. Now girls, if the yechidus is 10 hours, and you see 600 Bachrim, that's 1 minute per Bachrim. You know what that means? In and out, in and out, in and out. And every Bachar that walks in, the Rebbe knows who he is, and has to think about him, and has to answer him. It's the brain of the Rebbe is b'chlal impossible. How the Rebbe remembers everybody. The Rebbe never forgot anything. The Rebbe never forgot anything. You walked into the Rebbe remembered better than you what happened in the Yechidus 5 years before. The Rebbe knew everybody so well. It didn't take him any time to say, okay, who are you? What's your name? Who's your grandfather? The Rebbe never asked those questions. You were right there. The Rebbe was right with you. But you know what it means to see 600 people in one night? It's exhausting. So the Rebbe and Chayamushka called up Rabbi Leibel Groner of Linktree, and she said to Rabbi Groner, my husband has 2 nights scheduled to meet the Bacharim, 600 Brachim on Tuesday, 600 Brachim on Wednesday. Maybe you could suggest to my husband that he should do it Tuesday and Thursday. Skip a night. Wednesday night the Rebbe won't see people. Skip a night. A little chap in the bottom, catch his breath. Now the Rebbetzin wouldn't say it to the Rebbe. The Rebbetzin would not say it to the Rebbe. The Rebbetzin wanted Rabbi Groner to say it to the Rebbe. If the Rebbetzin wanted to say it to the Rebbe, she didn't have to call him up. And the Rebbetzin was always thinking about the Rebbe in this way, and she sort of was very, very particular. The Rebbetzin was very, very particular about quote-unquote things that she would ask or make the Rebbe do. The Rebbe said from the very beginning, I will take care of him, but I'm not going to tell him what to do. That's what I heard. So Rabbi Groner went into the Rebbe, and he didn't say that the Rebbetzin called, that wasn't the idea. He went into the Rebbe and suggested that maybe since the Rebbe has to see 600 Bachrim one night and 600 Bachrim another night, maybe he should take a night off. Tuesday night he'll see 600 Bachrim. Wednesday night the Rebbe will be able to learn and daven and do what he wants to do privately. And Thursday, so the Rebbe said, if I keep the Bachrim until Thursday night, they're going to go back late to yeshiva. And those are going overseas and not going back before Shabbos. How can I hold the Bachrim up from learning? And that was the end of that. Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and that was it. This is how the Rebbe operated. This is how the Rebbetzin operated. But here's the story. Now, girls, if you're doodling, stop doodling for this. I'll tell you when to go back to your doodle. Just story, listen. I heard the story from a witness who was there. The story probably happened in 1964 or 65. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. The phone rings in the Americas. Nobody picks up the phone. Because if you pick up the phone, you're responsible for whatever's going on the other side of the line. And in the Rebbe's offices, when the phone rang, it was always serious. So the phone is ringing and ringing and ringing. No, the Bachrim are hanging out in the office. They're not picking up the phone. Finally, Rabbi Chadakov, who had an office at the end of the hall, staggers. Rabbi Chadakov never went home before the Rebbe. But Rabbi Chadakov was a very great man, but he was not a Rebbe. He would sit in that room till 5, 6 in the morning till the Rebbe went home. But he was literally, his eyes were falling out of his head. He was so tired. He was exhausting. He was a human being. And he stayed in 7-7. He would go home with the Rebbe every night. In the earliest days, the person would walk home together. Later, they took home with a car. And the Rebbe used to talk to him. Rabbi Chadakov staggers out of his room, goes into the Americas, and picks up the phone. As soon as he picks up the phone, you could see from his body language that he's nervous. Now, Chadakov was not an easy man to unnerve, So the Bachrim understood that it has to be the Rebbetzin on the phone. Now, they're only hearing half a conversation. And the Rebbetzin was clearly saying to Rabbi Chadakov, go into my husband and tell me Yechidus is over. You know how Yechidus worked? There was a list. And the Rebbe sat there till the whole list went through. How much time you stayed in the Rebbe's room was up to the Rebbe. If the Rebbe kept you for 2 hours, people waited. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. There was still more people to go in. And the Rebbe says to Chadakov, my husband is stopping now. Don't go him and tell him, my wife called and, go in and tell there's no more people. There's more people. Apologize to the people. Tell them about my husband's coming home now. And then, but again, you don't hear what she's saying. You just see Rabbi Chadakov's body language and his reactions. He said, okay, I'll go in and I'll tell him. And then you hear him say, no, you darf nicht kommen, you don't have to come. The Rebbe said, I'm coming to 770, I'm picking him up and taking him home. The Rebbe drove. I'm coming, I'll pick him, taking him home. So Bechai said, no, you don't have to come, we'll get him home in one piece. 5 minutes later, the car was in front of 770, and the Rebbe waited. I don't know why, but the Rebbe almost never did this, but on this occasion, the Rebbe said, enough. And she called up and said to Chadukov, go get into my man. Even though there were still people who needed to go into Yechidus, and the Rebbe always stayed till every person saw him. The Rebbe was so sensitive to everybody else's needs. They always came before his own. And the Rebbe said, tonight, tell him it's finished. And she took him home. And the Rebbe took him home. This is a story which is a little bit different, that she said, I'm not going to tell my husband what to do. The relationship between the Rebbe and the Rebbe was very, very interesting. A guy told me that there are tapes of the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin conversing in his office. There are tapes, which we're not allowed to have. I promise you everything one day is going to be revealed. How do we have these tapes? Because sometimes there'd be a Yechidus where many people would go into the Rebbe together, like a group. And there's a group, they'd bring in benches, and people would sit down, and they'd also bring in a tape recorder. Sometimes they'd bring in a tape recorder, they'd push record, and nobody pushed stop. So the tape kept on running. And a guy told me he heard a conversation about 5 o'clock in the morning. Yechidus is over, and you hear a woman's shoes, lady's shoes, walking into the office. You could tell it from the steps. The Rebbe and the Rebbe have a conversation. He told me the content of the conversation, but I'm not repeating it because I can't repeat it correctly, and maybe I don't want to repeat it. But he says the respect they had for each other, the way they talked to each other. The way the Rebbe talked to the Rebbe said that they were so respectful. They were so respectful of each other. It was such a respect, They never complained, didn't put each other down, And basically the Rebbe was apologizing for the fact that it's 5 o'clock in the morning, he hasn't gone home yet. Whatever. And the Rebbe says, no, you don't apologize, But he described to me the nature of the respect. Another guy told me, another tape, which is more interesting, that Yechid is finished, and the tape recorder is running, and you partially hear the Rebbe sitting in his room at 5 o'clock in the morning, learning Torah. The Rebbe Pasha sat down to learn, and apparently he's learning loud enough for him to hear him learning, and the phone rings. Who's on the phone when the Rebbe's off 5 o'clock in the morning? It's the Rebbe's. And again, you don't hear both sides of the conversation, you only hear the Rebbe's half. But the Rebbe is sort of like apologizing for not coming home. I'm coming home soon, and so on and so forth. This is the relationship they had. And what do you think would happen when the Rebbe came home? The Rebbetzin lived for the Rebbe. Once the Rebbe became a Rebbe, she lived to make the Rebbe's job easier. The Rebbe came into the house, she was always awake. Always awake. Somebody once said to her, it's such a rachmanas on you, your husband comes home so late. Now guys, I want to explain to you what late means. I want to explain to you what late means. We have till 25 after, correct? I want to explain to you what late means, okay? For the first close to 30 years of the Rebbe's Nesius, on a regular day, the Rebbe didn't leave his office till 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, sometimes 12:30. He pushed it, stayed in the office and worked. Now, if it was a night of Yechidus, he could stay till 10 o'clock the next morning. Yechidus started at 8 o'clock at night, then it went till the line finished all night. And for the first 15 years, Yechidus was 3 times a week. Then it changed to 2 times a week. Okay? So the Rebbe, the earliest he came home was at 12 o'clock at night. Friday night! Somebody once asked me, how could the Rebbe's never had any guests? The Rebbe went home Friday night, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, even in the winter time. He sat in his office, he learned. And the Rebbetzin waited for him. And the Rebbe came home, and there was a set table, and they made Kiddush, and they sat together to the Shabbos, and Yom Tov, and the Rebbetzin was so happy. So one of her old friends said to her, it's such a rachmanas on you. Your husband is never home, and he comes home so late. So she snapped back. She spoke in Yiddish. Whenever he comes home, I'm awake. And his food is hot and fresh. She waited for the Rebbe all night. And the Rebbe came into the house. She prepared his food. She kept it hot and fresh. Now, if you have food that's supposed to be eaten at 7 o'clock at night, and it's eaten at 7 o'clock in the morning, you basically have 2 choices. This is before the days of the microwaves, Either the food is dried out like it's been cooked 100 times, or it's cold. The Rebbetzin had all these tricks that she kept the Rebbe's food hot and warm, and whenever the Rebbe came in, the Rebbetzin was there for him, and they would sit together whatever time they had. They spent a little bit of time together every day, and the Rebbe went to work. I mean, the Rebbe went to sleep, the Rebbe went to work. In the house. I heard a story from a good source that the Rebbe once went home, walked home, and walked back to 770. He walked into his house and went back to 770. 2 minutes after the Rebbe went back to 770, the phone rang in the hallway. They picked up the phone, and it was the Rebbetzin. And the Rebbetzin said to the Bachrim, someone has to tell the Rebbe that I'm awake. What happened was the Rebbe walked into the house, and he saw that the Rebbetzin had fallen asleep. She was waiting, but she fell asleep sitting in a chair. So he went back to 770, he wanted to let her sleep. 5 minutes later, she woke up, and she realized from the locks, from how many locks were locked or unlocked, that the Rebbe had come in and walked out. So she called 770, told the Bachram, go tell the Rebbe, I'm awake. Now here's the problem. Who's knocking on the Rebbe's door? 5 o'clock in the morning, who's in 770? A bunch of Bachrim who were mamish very chassidish, right? Because they don't have to sleep. They didn't sleep not by day, not by night, right? Believe it. The only one who didn't sleep not by night, not by day was the Rebbe. The boys who were up all night were, of course, learning chasidus all day long. Who's knocking on the Rebbe's door saying, excuse me, your wife just called, Rebbe, your wife just called, you can go home, you know? So it became a whole game how they're going to let the Rebbe know. So he put the letter under the door, the Rebbe has to bend down and pick it up. So I had to let the Rebbe know without letting the Rebbe know that the Rebbe called and that she's awake and he can come home. But that's the kind of relationship they had. The Rebbe was out of the house all night. He walked into the house, saw she fell asleep, went back to shul. Not to wake her. She woke up 5 minutes later. She realized right away that the Rebbe was in the house and she told him to come home. The connection was, the relationship, the respect was unbelievable. But on the other hand, I want you to know that when the Rebbe got older, which is when I was around, first of all, she suffered terribly from osteoporosis. You know what that means? She had a deficiency. Her bones, her body shrunk. She didn't have enough calcium. So she, many times, she suffered with her limbs. She broke many bones because she was very brittle. Her bones were very weak. And Bechlal, she became elderly and she needed help. I mean, the Rebbetzin, probably till she was close to 80, didn't need anybody's help. She took care of herself. I mean, she made Pesach herself, everything herself. She was a one-man show or a one-woman show. Don't help me, I can do it myself, you know. But as she got older and it became harder, so slowly but surely she allowed people to help her. You know, they started to shop for her. They started to clean for her. And I'm sure you know the stories. You know the stories, yeah? Where the Rebbe wanted to pay everybody. If you worked for the Rebbe, you had to pay. There was a bill, how many hours you worked, how much per hour. She put in cash to the penny how much he owed you. And people have stories where they told the Rebbe, if you're paying me, I'm not working for you. So she says, if not paying you, you're not working for me either. So it became a spiel. One of the sweet stories about people working for the Rebbetzin. There's so many stories like this, but it shows you how the Rebbetzin looked at the Rebbe's words, that there was a delivery of fruit that came to the house, a delivery of fruit from Raskin's fruit store. There was a bacher in the house, but the bacher did not have a chance to go to the front door and pick up the box of fruit and bring it into the kitchen, and the Rebbe came home. The Rebbe sees the box of fruit, and he picks it up, and he's carrying it into the kitchen. The Rebbe's been 80, 78, youngster. So the Rebbe says to the Rebbe, there's a bacher here. He could carry the fruit. So the Rebbe says to the Rebbe, he's also Jewish. In other words, how could you be Matriach? Why is he better than me? Just like he can carry the fruit, I can carry the fruit. This guy's name is Mendel Notek. He lives now in Seattle, Washington. And he says that after the Rebbe told this to the Rebbetzin, the Rebbetzin wouldn't give him any work. The Rebbe said he's a Yid. He did not a lot of work. So the guy would come to the house, he'd get paid, and he wasn't doing anything, because since the Rebbe said, Masiach lefi tumei, as part of a conversation, the Rebbe said, you can't put a Yid to work. So all the other Baruchim had jobs. He was in the house, he had a job, but you wouldn't give him any work. And he took a while for him to chapsach what's going on. The Rebbe just said to the Rebbetzin, and that was it, as far as she was concerned. He was in the house, he was being paid for his time, but he wasn't doing anything. So after a few days, he went over to the Rebbe and said, Hezekiah Rebbetzin, either you put him back to work, or I'm not coming back. I'm not going to stay here. I'm not going to work because the Rebbe said, so she gave him back his job. But it shows you, when the Rebbe said something to the Rebbe, and even though it was just as a gleich vetel, she took it so seriously. She took it so seriously. The Rebbetzin's mother lived till 1971. The Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe's wife, lived 20 years longer than he did. The Friedrich Rebbe passed away in 1950. The Rebbetzin, the Chamadina, passed away in 1971, the beginning of 71, Asar B'Tevis. So long as her mother was alive, the Rebbetzin would come to 770 to visit her mother a few times a week. She'd go into the house and sit in Fabring with her. Also, the Rebbetzin was very close to her older sister, Chana Garari. And oftentimes she'd come with the car and they travel, they go places together. The Rebbetzin was very by herself. She didn't need help. In the mamish, the last years of her life, people helped her. But by the way, I forgot to say something. I'm sorry, I'm winding back the tape. I started something and I didn't finish it. When the Rebbetzin got older and got weaker and life became harder for her, the Rebbe started to go home very early. In other words, when I was a child, the Rebbe went home 12 o'clock on a regular night. When I was a bocher, the Rebbe went home right after Ma'ariv. If there was no Fabrengen, the Rebbe would leave 7 very early, 7 o'clock. And when the Rebbetzin was older, and it was hard for the Rebbetzin to be alone, so the Rebbe changed the schedule. The Rebbe would go home very early. In the wintertime, he'd go home 6 o'clock even. And he would come back the next day, 10 o'clock in the morning, depending on what day it was. But the Rebbe took his work home with him, and he did the work, the same work he could have done in 770, he did in the house. But the Rebbe went home. The Rebbe, in other words, when the Rebbetzin physically needed the Rebbe to be around, the Rebbe changed his schedule to be physically around more. And Mistama, you know the story of Mrs. Sternberg, that the Rebbetzin, they didn't want the Rebbetzin to be alone. So if there was a Fabrengen, someone had to be in the house before the Rebbe would leave. This is only the last years. So it was once a Purim, and the Rebbe had to go back to Fabrengen, and the nurse, the woman who was supposed to be with the Rebbetzin, canceled. And they needed someone to come hang out with the Rebbetzin for the night, a nurse. And they couldn't find a nurse. And the Rebbetzin called up Mrs. Sternberg and said to her, my husband is not going to leave the house until the nurse comes. You got to get him a nurse. So they called up nursing services, and there was a lady in the Bronx who they wanted to hire as a nurse. It was last minute, and it was hard to get a person. And she says, what are they going to take to get you to Brooklyn? She says, if you send me a limousine, I'll come to Brooklyn. So you got a limousine. They got a limousine. They went to pick the lady up. The Rebbe didn't leave the house until that person came. There was that part of that relationship as well. The answer to that question is, I have no idea. It's very hard to understand that relationship. The Rebbe Zachana lived in a different house. You know, the Rebbe Zachana could have lived with the Rebbe. She didn't. She had her own apartment. They obviously spent time together. I have no idea what their relationship was. I do not know what their relationship was. But the Rebbe had her own show. She was president of Kingston, and people used to come in. The Rebbe Zachana was always hosting people. She was very different than the Rebbe. The Rebbe Zachana needed people. The Rebbe Zachana didn't need people. That's what Mrs. Khan explained to me. So they both hosted people, but for the Rebbetzin, it was a responsibility. For the Rebbetzin Chana, it was not just a responsibility, she needed people around. And she writes in her journal, the Rebbe's mother, how lonely she is. She had all these guests, all these people coming to her house. And she writes, she's very lonely. She didn't have anyone to talk to. It's hard to understand, but that's the Metzias, Hadvar. That's the Metzias. The Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka, didn't come to 770. Period. She would come to see her mother 3 times a week. She would drive her own car. She'd park in front of 770. She would go in the side staircase. She would not go up the front steps, the side staircase, which is underneath the basement. And she'd do an elevator, she'd go up to the second floor and see her mother. People saw her coming and going. But people had enough seichel and enough respect to leave her alone. In other words, the first smart aleck would have taken one picture of the Rebbetzin driving her car, getting into the car, getting out of the car, getting into 770, getting in the elevator, go up to her mother, would have been the last time she did it. And the beginning of the Rebbetzin see as people had seichel. When I was growing up, if you see the Rebbetzin, you ran to look at her and took pictures. So she didn't come around. It was very simple. She just didn't come around. But in the earlier years, people had seichel. They left her alone. Many people have told me that they remember seeing the Rebbetzin, and they knew, you make believe you know who she is. She would come through the basement. So if you were in Bis Medrash, and you happened to be in the basement, you could see her walk in the back door, go through the elevator, push the button. In those days, there was no locks. When I was a kid growing up, 770 had no locks. All of those were open. The elevator, we played in that elevator, don't ask. But the Rebbe would go up to see her mother, and she'd leave. If it was not a night of Yechidus, a lot of times after she saw her mother, she would go downstairs and she'd go in to see the Rebbe. And she would spend time in the Rebbe's room. There's actually pictures that were taken illegally of the Rebbe standing in his room, showing the Rebbe's mail. And the Rebbe is sitting and reading the letters, and the Rebbe is standing over her as she reads a letter. The Rebbe shared with her. And I heard from people who knew that if it was not a night of Yechidus, and the Rebbe Tzachaya was driving home, they would go home together. They would leave 770 together. So two different people told me two different stories. One person told me that the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin would walk out of 770 together, get into the car and drive home. Another person told me, are you nuts? The Rebbe would go into the car and she'd sit and wait, and a few minutes later the Rebbe would come out, get into the car and go home. So who's lying? One person tells me he saw the Rebbe and the Rebbe walk out 770 together many, many times. And get into the car and go home. Are you nuts? Never happened. The Rebbe went into the car first, and then they waited, and the Rebbe came out and drove home. What's the answer to the question? Take a guess. Depends on the different years. In the earlier years, where Chassidim were more respectful, they walk out together. In the later years, the Chassidim were less respectful, so the Rebbe went first, and the Rebbe followed. So a guy told me he saw this with his own eyes. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin walked out of 770, and it was pouring. And the Rebbetzin says to the Rebbe, you don't have an umbrella. The Rebbe never used an umbrella. The Rebbe used to say, soldiers don't use umbrellas. The Rebbe used to walk in the rain. So the Rebbe said to the Rebbetzin, but you have an umbrella. And the Rebbetzin said to the Rebbe, but it's raining. So they turned around, went back into the Rebbe's room. 5 seconds later, the rain stopped. They went back out, and went to the car, and they went home. I heard the story from more than one person in different ways, but I think that's the correct version. There were 2 times, a guy told me a story which is very interesting. The guy is around my age, he's maybe a year older than me. The story happened in the 80s, in the Tafshin Mems, that he was a Bach in Yeshiva. You're listening to the story, stop doodling for this one, okay? This story is worth listening to. He was a Bach in Yeshiva, and I have 3 minutes. He was supposed to go on Shlichus someplace, and the Shlichus was cancelled. He had no Shlichus. He was learning in 770, that means. He went upstairs to the Rashag. The Rebbe's brother had an office on the second floor. He got into the elevator to go up to the second floor to go to speak to Moshe Glukowski, who had an office there, about staying in 770. Anyway, he gets into the elevator, and a lady gets into the elevator with him. He knew right away that he was in the elevator with the Rebbe Achei Temimim. And the Rebbe looks at him, and he was not from a Lubavitcher home, he was a Baal Tshuva. The Rebbe one look at him and says, what's your name? And he answers her. He says, where are you learning? He answers her. So what's going to happen next year? So he tells her the truth, that he was supposed to go on Shlichus, and the Shlichus fell through, and he doesn't know what he's going to do. He's thinking he'd learn at 770. Anyway, the elevator comes to the second floor, the Rebbe gets out, he goes to the third floor. Within hours, it gets a call from the secretaries of the Rebbe, come into the office. He had a Shlichus. What do you think happened? The Rebbetzin saw him and spoke to him and took care of it. I don't know who she spoke to, whether she spoke to the Rebbe. Within hours, the guy had a shlichus. But this was the Rebbetzin. The two times that Chassidim got to see the Rebbe in action was when the Rebbe had his heart attack in Tafshan Lamed Ches, and by the story with the Sfarim. That's when you saw the deep involvement of the Rebbe in the Rebbe's life, how much he cared about the Rebbe, and in the Rebbe's work. But otherwise, unless you were close to her, and most of us were not zoichet to be close to her, even though according to Mrs. Khan, all we had to do was make a phone call. We could have gone and seen her and had a visit with her. She was out of sight. And I want you to know that the reason the Rebbe is so important is because after she passed away, the Rebbe did not stop talking about her. Talked about her and talked. The Rebbe wanted the Rebbe to be in her life, and he wrote, because the Rebbe in her life will be